This is the second half of the Week 9 lecture on victims of intimate partner violence. Again, this chapter primarily focuses upon female victims, and in fact this segment will almost entirely devote itself, will entirely devote itself to female victims of male-to-female intimate partner violence, for reasons that were mentioned in the previous discussion from this chapter. This particular part of the lecture focuses upon what happens after the abusive episode, how the system responds, and the victim's decision, the process involved in deciding to leave or to stay in the relationship. There's a gap in legal resources and, frankly, inadequate resources in the criminal justice system. Sanctions that are applied in cases of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, often seem to be very inadequate in providing protection and in ending the abuse. One of the problems that victims often find themselves facing is the fact that there are no affordable legal resources for victims, or I should say few affordable legal resources for victims. Women who don't have an income adequate to pay an attorney or retainer to represent them in domestic violence cases a lot of times will find themselves outgunned because their spouses typically earn more than they do and sometimes can't afford private attorneys. And in a court system, unfortunately, the way our system works these days, if you don't have an attorney, you're not going to be adequately represented in almost all cases, even in the best of courtrooms, because the attorneys know what to present to sway the court in one direction or another that none of us that don't have that legal training will understand and be prepared to present. And so the ability to actually hire an attorney and to have one stand with you through this process is something that is a major issue for violence for victims of intimate partner violence. There is an agency called the National Domestic, well, not an agency, but the National Domestic Violence Pro Bono Directory exists, which is supposedly a resource where you can find attorneys to represent you. Victims can find an attorney to represent them for free, but this doesn't seem to be particularly useful. And there are some organizations in this state, such as Alaska Legal Services, who will sometimes help victims find attorneys who will represent them pro bono, or will delay payment for their services. Protective orders, are available so that when a victim leaves, or an abuser is arrested, or a victim leaves an abusive relationship, they can apply for a temporary restraining order that the court will sign with adequate information, generally, that will keep that abuser from making contact with her for up to 20 days. And at the end of that period, there is a hearing about a long-term protective order. The victim needs to show up for the long-term protective order, and I believe the perpetrator may not need to, but in any event, a lot of times what will happen is in that 20-day period, a lot of things go on, and the victim is discouraged from pursuing and following through in the case, and so may not show up for the long-term protective hearing, and without that, the court dismisses the protective order. Protective orders are available, and they're more available than they were at one time, but even when they are signed and put in force, there are indications that I think as many as 40% or 60% of protective orders are violated. And so a lot of times the perpetrator, the abuser, doesn't feel as though he really needs to pay attention to it. And part of the reason for that is because sometimes the courts are reluctant to enforce those protective orders when they are violated. But there has been a movement to encourage courts to look at what's called a permanent protective order that would not require individuals to keep coming back to court to request continued protection. As mentioned in the previous lecture, there are times when that fear and danger continues for years after the episode, and so a permanent protective order would be helpful in situations such as that. When protective orders are issued, the other issue is sometimes it's very difficult to serve them, and offenders, abusers are not subject to protective orders if they haven't been served, and so law enforcement has to take the time to find the person, and that can be very difficult. And so in somewhere from a fifth to a third of those cases, sometimes in one study, at least in California, or a couple different studies in California, protective orders were never even served. When there are violations in those protective orders, sometimes judges won't stick to the sentencing mandates. So the violation of protective order, the rates are about 50%. Judges don't always arrest violators, and yet still, 4/5 of the women involved in these situations say that having protective orders does reduce the violence. Weapons in a domestic violence offense are more likely to be used, by the way, by women than by men, but still, for persons convicted of domestic violence crime, it is illegal for them to carry or possess a weapon according to federal law. Some of that, I think, arising from the Violence Against Women Act and other laws. And so if an individual is, and this I was told once by an FBI agent, includes even when, as will often be the case, offenders will negotiate a plea, so reduce the typical charge in a say a typical IPV case in Alaska is assault in the 4th degree domestic violence, causing fear and injury. And a lot of times, in order to avoid a trial, abusers will agree to a lesser sentence, so it could be harassment or something along that line, interfering in the report of a domestic violence crime. And the FBI agent told us that even in those situations where the charge has been reduced from that typical DV crime to something lesser, any crime associated with domestic violence is enough to make it illegal for that person to carry a weapon. And so offenders should not have, abusers should not have weapons if they've been convicted of any crime associated with domestic violence. Historically speaking, family violence was something that I think was probably trivialized by law enforcement, not really recognizing the serious nature of the injuries and the problems that they create for the victims and for the children in the home. And this, I think, kind of ties back into that discussion that we had a few weeks ago about children as victims, and how when an individual assaults their child, they may not be charged with the crime, but if they assaulted the neighbor child the same way, they would be. This notion of ownership, this is that patriarchy kind of underlying of a lot of what happens in our system. And I want you to understand, as I talk about law enforcement and attitudes of police officers and different problems that law enforcement has in enforcing domestic violence calls, this doesn't mean every police officer by any stretch of the imagination. And we do have a number of law enforcement agents that are more enlightened and who understand domestic violence than we might have had 10 or 15 years ago. But still, there is an element of individuals within the law enforcement community that struggle with the issues around domestic violence and seeing it as a criminal act. But law enforcement has come a long way. And in the olden days, law enforcement would go out and send the abuser for a walk around the block and then talk to the woman about what she did and what she can do or not do in the future so this won't happen again, and how to keep things calm in the household. Kind of sending him out to cool down and telling her how to take control of the situation, which, if you listen to the last discussion lecture that I had, she doesn't have control of the situation, and we know that. But there are officers that may have certain beliefs that would make them very reluctant to make an arrest, and these includes beliefs like, for instance, that when a male assaults a victim, it's the victim's fault. There may have been justification for him assaulting the victim even. If he beats her and she stays, that she's not really a victim in their mind. And this is not an uncommon attitude not only among law enforcement but among the general public. Battered women seeing as being manipulative, not believable. Law enforcement officers believe really that police involvement isn't the best way to stop intimate partner violence. In fact, statistics indicate that it probably is. some consider DV calls as not real police work, but kind of conversely, at the same time, intervening in partner violence is the most dangerous form of police work. And a lot of times when you do see police officers that have been murdered in the course of their duty, it is because they've been out on a domestic violence call. And you just follow the news and see that this is the case. Things are that out of control with these abusers. Since 1997 in Alaska, officers are required to make an arrest if there is an injury evident when they're called out on DV calls. They can't just send them out for a walk now. People are getting arrested. Some studies have showed that police have used a double standard in determining probable cause for arrest. That, if you assault a stranger, you might be arrested, but not so much in a domestic violence call for the same kinds of injuries. Again, the law should prevent that now, but there have been times when police fail to arrest batterers that have used lethal weapons, that have done things like throwing women downstairs and those kinds of things that can kill people. So this mandatory arrest protocols were developed in order to respond to some of those incidents, not just in this state, mind you. Now this is a national problem we're talking about. There is a 30% decrease in violence after an arrest in a relationship, and 60% drop in a 6-month follow-up. The statistics confuse me a little bit because usually the higher number is the shorter term one, but I suppose that tells you a little bit about how in domestic violence situations that the victim's never really out of the woods. The fact that there's a 60% drop in 6-month follow-up suggests to you there's a lot of people, perhaps the likelihood of re-abuse continues to increase for months after an arrest made in an IPV situation. But these arrest policies don't consistently exert a deterrent effect. One of the indications, by the way, about police resistance in some studies showed that there's been an increase in arrests of females, even when those females were victims. And the folks in the women's shelter will tell you this is because batterers know where to hit, and that typically injuries are often in areas that are covered by clothing, and so there's not as evident to a police officer, and a victim may be very reluctant to challenge the batterer in a situation when the police officers are on the scene, because she knows that if he's not arrested, she's going to get more after the police officer leaves, and so she may just keep her mouth shut. And in defending herself and fighting back, she may cause some bruising and injuries to the batterer that is more evident. And so the police officer goes on the scene, sees the injuries to the male, sees a very emotional female, decides she's the one who was the problem, makes the arrest, and doesn't really look further into this to see whether or not she was defending herself. And so and at times both of the partners are arrested, again, in a situation where she may be defending herself. And so this is one of, again, some indications a lot of people think about this resistance to the notion that a patriarchal kind of perception of whether or not males have a right to do what they do. Sometimes, victims don't want the batterer arrested, and that's frustrating to police officers when they go out in the scene. Now, the states have established, and I think Alaska is one of these, that no drop policies, but also later on there's a slide where we'll talk about this, that states do not rely upon the victim to, at least Alaska does not, and other states rely upon the victim to press charges, that the state, the crime is a crime against the state, and so the state can press the charges, and that kind of takes the victim off the hook as far as following through with the charges, and also prevents the victim from being intimidated into dropping charges. Alaska does not have as far as I know, really, I'm sure of this, does not have mandatory no-drop policies. Victims frequently recant complaints later on. And one way of recanting a complaint basically is just to not show up to the long-term protective order hearings later on. And there's a number of reasons why they won't do that, and we'll be talking about that here in a minute. Male batterers often receive significantly shorter sentence than perpetrators of other crimes for similar injuries. Again, there is this notion of a patriarchal notion that a man's home is his castle and what he does in his home is his business and his right. But about a third of the reported offenses and 3/5 of the arrests resulted in prosecution, and more than half of those charged were subsequently convicted. So a third of reported offenses resulting in prosecution means that 2/3 of the offenses don't. Alaska, among other states, again consider intimate partner violence as a crime against the state, and so prosecution proceeds even when the victim declines. And there are a lot of reasons why victims will be reluctant to testify, including things like the fear of retaliation by the abuser. Batterers re-abuse before the trial at a rate of 30 to 50%. So in between the arrest and the trial for this, oftentimes victims find themselves battered again, and that's certainly a pretty convincing argument against testifying against the batterer. Because again, you realize that in half of the times when they go to trial, perhaps this person's going to be convicted. So 50% chance that the batterer is going to get off without any sanctions. Pretty intimidating to the victim. There is really a lack of sufficient victim support, tangible victim support out there. I mean, there is some, but not enough to really help the victim all the way through this process. There is a lack of preparation for testifying on the part of the prosecutor. A lot of times the prosecutors don't really have the time to help the victim prepare for that, although some of the DA's office, including the Kenai DA's office, do have victim advocates that will try to help in that area and prepare the victim for trial. There's concern that she won't be believed. Again, we talked about the blaming that goes on in society in the previous lecture, and so it's pretty sensible for her to believe that that blaming may be carried forward into the courtroom. May fear that the abuser would not be found guilty, may be dependent on the abuser for housing and finances, and so if he is found guilty, that puts her over the barrel for other reasons, again, that we have talked about earlier. And believe this or not, even at times victims aren't informed of court dates, and so they don't even know that they can show up. One study showed that 75% of the attorneys have said that judges allow inappropriate questions of victims on the stand by the other side. And so a lot of times when victims do get there, the courts don't really control the process well enough to protect the victim in that setting. And when sentencing occurs, there's extreme variation in judicial sentencing. Judges sometimes fail to follow sentencing guidelines, and I believe the text even points to this one really just outrageous circumstance some years ago where a man was convicted of killing his wife, and the judge complained at the time of the trial of having to at the time of sentencing rather, of having to impose criminal sanctions upon an individual who didn't commit a criminal act. It just can be sometimes. Now, that is certainly the extreme, and that is not the case with most judges, but it's safe to say that judges are often inadequately trained in intimate partner violence, and so sometimes aren't aware of the implications of the crime, and a lot of times will allow themselves to reduce sentences on individuals. The batterers a lot of times don't have other criminal histories and other criminal records, and so that's something that judges will use kind of in favor of the batterer and giving him a light sentence, even when injuries were serious with his wife or with his partner. There was one study that said that one way that dispositions can be effective in domestic violence crimes is to engage or to apply what's called intrusive dispositions, and that this does help to deter re-abuse. Things where the batterer really knows that there is the involvement of the system, and that includes jail time, maybe work release before they're out of jail, electronic monitoring to make sure that we know where they're at and what they're doing while they're out, and probation periods where there's an extended follow-up to that. Those kinds of things, as you can see here, this one study showed that the re-abuse was less than 25% in cases with this kind of disposition, whereas re-abuse was over 50% in a control group without this kind of intrusive disposition. So what's behind women's decisions to stay or leave? barriers that might prevent them from leaving include things like you can see here in partners promise to change or apologizes, not having any money, having any place to go. There really is a kind of a separation, a dichotomy there of some things the partner is saying, which is actually the larger percentage you see of these situations. This is cited, and this is interesting because it tells you of the hope that the victim has that man that she married is still there, and that is one of the reasons why women keep going back, because they keep looking for that person again that they fell in love with. But there are all sorts of barriers to influence this situation that include family and social role expectations, the psychological problems that come out of the abuse, environment, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of reasons why women might want to stay. Those who do leave tend to be younger. They have a protective order usually. They've had experience leaving this relationship previously, so the first time they may not be, well, once having left this relationship, it may be more likely they'll leave again. They tend to be vulnerable psychologically, probably saw a physician because of the abuse, so the injuries were severe enough to take them to get medical care. Probably didn't experience childhood abuse or had very little childhood abuse. That's something that seems to help in this situation. And they were able to find external support, so that would include support of family perhaps, maybe a job, legal representation, those kinds of things. But there is this pressure to stay with this partner no matter what, and that is, there are religious implications with that, there are social expectations of that, there are personal expectations that when you make that vow to love, honor, and respect for better or worse, no matter what. This is all about those qualities of love, hope, and commitment that is mentioned here. If there are shelter services in the area, it makes it much more possible for battered women to leave. What are some of the things, there's the contradictory results from studies about whether the presence of physical assaults actually, the actual physical assaults was a major factor in the decision to leave. It is a factor. Escalation in assaults is another factor, but what some of the studies have suggested is that just dissatisfaction with the violence inside the victim was probably more closely associated with leaving. It isn't so much what he's doing as is what's going on inside of her, it seems. Exposure to psychological abuse increased the likelihood of leaving, which is, to me, is counterintuitive, because I would think that this would probably make the victim feel more helpless. But studies indicate that this is probably something that's more helpful in leaving. And I'm not saying that in a positive way, but things like poverty, religious belief, financial dependence, all those things we've been talking about really entrap the women in a lot of these relationships. And on average, and this is something you'll hear in women's shelter programs as well, women leave and return to their abuser on average 5 to 6 times before they decide to leave for good. That's an average, so that means that some women get it pretty quickly, others have to go a lot longer than this. And it is a process of understanding what is going on that is in place, and it isn't something that happens and it's over. This is a process, and so this isn't 5 or 6 times being battered either. It's 5 or 6 times leaving after being battered before they finally leave for good. So the forces of keeping them in place are very strong. The abuse might stop when a woman leaves, but leaving itself does not guarantee her safety. As we've mentioned before, to leave can be dangerous, if not fatal. So many decide it's safer to stay. Some statistics here. The assault victimization rates of women who have separated from their husbands was 3 times higher than that of women divorced from their husband, and 25 times higher than those women who are still married. And so there's a significant difference there in assault rates. 75% of the women who were killed by their male partners and 85% of those who were severely beaten had left or tried to leave during the previous year. And for some victims, the decision is not whether to leave, but whether to live. Economic dependence low income, poverty, all highly associated with IPV and child abuse, and prevents many women from leaving and or return to the batterer. And when we look at things in society that we can do to help victims, housing, financial resources, ability to get credit cards and to be able to establish credit, to have affordable childcare, to have reliable transportation services available. All of these things aren't often not there in the environment around the victim, and so it becomes virtually impossible sometimes for the victim to establish an independent household. This is true for in Social Work 106 when we look at social welfare. This is something that is, these barriers are the same barriers that women on welfare in general face. And of course, many women on welfare have been battered, and that's one of the reasons they're there. But this is an area that really needs the focus of our society and our profession if we're going to help victims of intimate partner violence actually leave and stay away from those partners. There are shelters, as mentioned earlier. These shelters for battered women have saved many lives, and one of the first things they emphasize is safety planning for the female abuse victims who are planning to leave their abusers. They help them establish a course or a process to get out of it and to do so safely. And of course, the children are included in that safety plan. And women who have accessed shelter services are more likely to leave abusive relationships, so it's a very positive step in the life of a victim to contact individuals in women's shelter programs. Some shelters, and this does include the shelters in our area, have a program called transitional housing, and what this does really is it gives victims a place to go when they begin to get on their feet after they've left their spouse, and to stay for a longer period of time. It isn't a shelter. It's an apartment or a building with apartments in it that are available at low or no cost to victims and their children, so that now women in these facilities are responsible for their own daycare and all those other things, but it is a place for them to land where they can seek treatment when necessary and go about establishing some economic independence. Affordable permanent housing, as it says here, is a barrier for female victims a lot, and so that's one of the reasons why they return to their abuser. And so this transitional housing program is something that's key in the bigger picture. One other factor before we close this discussion, and it's something that really we could spend half a semester talking about this, but there's a book that was written some years ago by the name of The Batterer as Parent, and you can find it on Amazon. It written by Bancroft and Silverman, and discusses how batterers are often very successful in using custody litigation process to further the abuse of their victims. One of the reasons the victims stay with their batterers is because they fear that the batterer is going to be successful in getting the children removed from them. As unlikely as this may seem, this is in fact often the case. Batterers are able to convince custody investigators, child protection workers, family mediators, the judges in courts, all these players in this system, that they are the better parents, sometimes law enforcement as well. And they oftentimes point to the emotional and financial problems that their victims are left with as a result of the abuse. They demonstrate that they have better resources to provide for the kids. They're not experiencing the apparent psychological problems that their victims are experiencing, which of course is probably the result of the abuse: the depression, the post-traumatic stress symptoms, the sleep disturbances, probably unstable employment or no employment, possibly as a result of those psychological disturbances. I mean, there's a whole host of things. When the victims leave that relationship, their life doesn't instantly get better, even if the abuse occurs. There are a lot of problems ahead, and so it isn't surprising that a person who may have been very dependent upon the batterer to begin with is having trouble establishing herself independently. And so the batterer looks much better as a parent, looks more stable psychologically, probably has kept his job through all of this. And so oftentimes the courts fall for this, and children go with batterers, and and victims know that this could happen. And so, and interestingly, the children sometimes are turned against the victims in battering relationships by the batterers for a number of different reasons that, we'll talk about later on when we talk about the effects of domestic violence on children. So this is another big reason why women often decide to leave. And if you're working with victims in a role that impacts custody decisions, please be very careful to keep this in mind. And I highly recommend you read this book because it is much more in depth than the few lines on this slide can even begin to tell you about. So that's it for this week. In the next week, we'll move on to another topic. And so let me know if any questions arise from this lecture or this material. Talk to you later. Bye.